Europe in the 1500s was changing. The ignorance and oppression of the Dark Ages was being swept away by a new class of people who emerged out of the darkness with a thirst for knowledge that led inventors and artisans toward ways in which to mass-produce the written word. The art of warfare was also changing, from close hand-to-hand combat in the field to long-distance fighting with artillery, cannon, and firearms. Seemingly overnight, the once protective body of armor of knights and noblemen became less protective and more ceremonial, thus providing the metal workers and goldsmiths of Venice a lively occupation, engraving decorative motifs on personal armor. Based upon this shifting of events, it is widely accepted that the origins of engraving coincided with the flowering of the Italian Renaissance and quickly spread throughout the rest of Europe. In engraving armor, the method used by the goldsmiths to prove their work was to first transfer their original designs to the surface of the metal, then incise the lines with a metal scriber, cutting deeply into the surface. Once completed, they would then rub a thick mixture of lamp-blackened oil into the engraved lines and hand-press a thin paper sheet into the linear depressions. The image formed was a result of the ink being transferred from the engraved line below the surface of the metal directly onto the paper. It wouldn't be long before someone else made the connection between engraving on armor and engraving on paper for art and book illustrations. Toward the latter part of the 15th century, a young woodcut artist named Albrecht Dürer returned to Germany after spending 4 years in Italy, where he had learned the art of copperplate engraving from the Venetian goldsmiths. Dürer's engravings were greatly influenced by the Italian sensibilities because the Italians excelled in engraving on metal, whereas the coarser, more common woodcut illustrations of Dürer were more closely suited to the German black-letter style. In his heavier woodcuts, Dürer spoke directly to the common people, dealing with subjects and themes in such a way as that they could not fail to be moved and edified by his depictions of allegorical and religious themes. However, in this fine-line metal engraving, like the Return of the Prodigal Son, his subjects and interests were aimed more toward a refined and discriminating audience, men of wealth and property, the cultivated merchant class who were beginning to form the new German aristocracy. Dry-point etching was given impetus in the art world when, during the 17th century, the Dutch painter Rembrandt produced beautifully etched masterpieces with his flawless techniques. In this earlier work of Rembrandt, called On the Way to Jerusalem, showed a beautiful example of his sensitive and controlled use of dry-point etching. For his later work, Christ's Teaching, Rembrandt printed the etching on silky china paper, which had a tendency to soften and spread the ink, the effect being almost painterly in quality, depth, and modeling. In the 18th century, Giovanni Giappolo and Antonio Canal, known as Canaletto of Venice, were among those of comparable ability to the Dutch masters, while elsewhere in Europe, notably in France and Spain, others were beginning to produce portrait masterpieces in mezzotints. Mezzotint is an engraving process that begins with a roughening of the entire surface of the metal plate with a roulette, after which the image is burnished out of the roughened plate. When inked and proofed, the plate produces a soft, velvety light and dark impression similar to that of a textured painting. Meanwhile, Thomas Bewick of Northumbria in England had revived the art of wood engraving. Wood engraving, unlike the technique of block wood cutting on the surface of the board, made appropriate use of the end grain of hard woods in which to engrave an image. The result is an engraved image, not as hard-edged as metal, but not as soft and grainy as board. He is known principally for his engraving of animals, plants, and woodland scenes. In 1768, Paul Revere, an enterprising silversmith from Lexington, Massachusetts, printed a line engraving depicting the landing of British troops in Boston Harbor. This single print no doubt helped fan the flames of rebellion against the British Crown under King George III. Paul Revere was also commissioned by the Provisional Congress of Massachusetts to engrave the first U.S. security banknotes to help finance the War for Independence. By the mid-19th century, fashionable society became a steady source of work for engravers on both sides of the Atlantic. The following examples of original mid-19th century engravings are from the Crane Museum in Dalton, Massachusetts. Engraved stationery, elegant calling cards, formal invitations, currency, all required the intricate handwork of the engraver. The engraved technique used on the portrait of Washington on the US dollar is basically the same linear technique first developed in Europe several hundred years ago. Whenever people think of engraving, this is invariably the first impression that comes to mind. By the middle of the 20th century, dramatic changes had taken place in the printing industry, and the once bright light of engraving appeared to diminish as new technology and improved methods in color lithography made it possible to produce higher volumes of work at greater speeds in shorter time. Stochastic screening at 2400 dpi, computer to plate printing, color substitution in 4-color process, the creative use of gloss and matte varnish, matched colors to enhance the impact of printed images, hexachrome printing, ghosted images and 4-color process surprinted over white opaque foil on color substrate are but a few of the printing options currently available to designers.